The thing about the cold is that it doesn't just numb the skin. It silences everything else. In December 1944, along a forgotten, frozen stretch of the European front, the war had entered a phase of mechanical exhaustion. The great, roaring push had slowed to a desperate, grinding halt. And in the middle of this vast, frozen silence sat a tank named Jezebel. But Jezebel was silent for the wrong reason. Sergeant Roy Asher, ace to the men who depended on his wrench, wiped his hand across his forehead, leaving a streak of black grease and frozen sweat. He stood knee-deep in the mud and the dark promise of winter, staring into the open engine bay of the only operational M4 Sherman in their sector. A dead tank is a coffin waiting for a wake. And that's exactly what Jezebel was becoming. The temperature had dropped so fast the night before that the freezing mud had seized every bearing, every hose, every connection. The engine refused to turn over. The diagnosis was simple, brutal, and impossible. A specific, critical oil pump housing gasket had failed. Without it, the tank was not a weapon. It was 18 tons of scrap steel, marooned 60 yards from where the enemy was waiting for morning. Ace climbed halfway inside the engine bay, the raw metal biting his fatigues. He ran his hand over the failure point. He knew the part number by heart. He knew the requisition form was lost somewhere between a muddy port in Belgium and a paper-pushing sergeant far behind the lines. The official, correct part was days, maybe weeks, away. They had hours. This is the impossible choice war mechanics rarely talk about, the decision to accept defeat, or the decision to try a repair so reckless it might kill your friends. Ace pulled his flashlight beam away from the engine, searching the floor of the tank. Not for the correct part. He'd known for days he didn't have it, but for a memory. He remembered a salvage yard weeks ago, back when they thought they were just fixing dents and patching holes. He'd seen something there, tucked away in a pile of rusted-out civilian scrap. Something so common, so completely out of place in a war machine, that he had laughed and tossed it in his tool duffel as a joke. He yanked the duffel open, spilling wrenches, bolts, and rags onto the frozen ground. His hands, shaking not from cold but from a sudden, paralyzing fear of his own idea, sifted through the metal. And there it was. Small. Copper. Ridiculous. It wasn't a military gasket. It wasn't designed for high-pressure oil or the crushing vibrations of a Sherman tank in combat. It was a standard, quarter-inch section of copper water pipe, the kind you'd find under the kitchen sink of an average American home, regulating the flow of tap water. It was a stupid repair. A desperate, insulting shortcut. Ace picked it up. It felt impossibly light, like a feather holding the weight of the entire front line. What is the real cost of a shortcut in war? He thought. Could the life of a dozen men be held in place by something designed for an American basement? This wasn't about courage. Not yet. This was about cold utility. This was about a mechanic, exhausted and far from home, staring at an impossible situation and reaching for the only piece of home he had left. The world Ace was in was one of dwindling supplies and impossible demands. The reality of the late war was not all grand assaults. It was the sheer, brutal maintenance required to keep the war moving. Everything, from the fuel to the treads to the smallest brass fitting, was stretched thin. The men who operated the guns were heroes, but the war was often decided by the men who kept the fuel moving. Ace was 32, 3 years older than most of his company. He'd been pulled out of an auto shop in Philadelphia, drafted not for the rifle, but for the wrench. He didn't wear his uniform with the fire of a young recruit. He wore it with the weary competence of a man who just wanted to punch out and walk back to his wife. His focus was always on the integrity of the machine. Always the right part. Until now. He felt a shadow fall over him. It was Lieutenant Jenkins, the tank commander, his arm wrapped tightly with a blood-soaked field dressing. Jenkins was pale, breathing in shallow gasps. Report, Ace. His voice was a raw whisper, grating against the cold air. Ace didn't look up. Gasket failure, Lieutenant. The housing pressure's dead. It'll hold for about 10 minutes, maybe, if I can patch it with this trash. But the right part's not coming. Jenkins didn't curse or yell. He simply leaned against the cold steel of the tank, his eyes fixed on the distant, silent woods. Ace, listen to me. Intelligence says they're massing on the flank. They know this gap is open. If we can't get some steel in their hull by sunrise, the whole line breaks. They walk right through us. We are the steel, Sergeant. You understand. The commander's admission wasn't an order. It was a confession. It stripped away the heroism and revealed the bare sacrifice. Their lives were now tied to this single, sputtering machine. The fear Ace felt moments ago, the professional fear of a broken machine, was instantly replaced by a deep, paralyzing, human dread. This wasn't about a repair log anymore. This was about watching his friends die because he was too afraid to try an insane, stupid fix. This is where retention locks in. Ace looked down at the tiny, non-military copper tube in his hand. He wasn't building a Sherman tank, he was plumbing a bathtub. And yet, this simple, common piece of pipe now held the potential for either salvation or incineration. He didn't answer the lieutenant. He just jammed his tools into the engine bay. The correct procedure would take hours, meticulous cleaning, and preparation. He didn't have hours. He worked fast, a flurry of panicked, practiced motion. He ground the soft copper pipe, bending it with pure force, cursing the civilian dimensions. He forced the ill-fitting piece into the housing. He clamped it down, too tight, risking the threads, tightening until the copper bit into the surrounding metal. It was an engineering atrocity. It was also the only chance they had. He pulled himself out, mud-streaked and breathing hard. "All right, Lieutenant. Try it. But don't tell the whole damn company what I used." Jenkins, leaning on the side of the tank, nodded once, his face a mask of pain and grim determination. He reached inside, grasping the main ignition switch. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with the knowledge that this single flicker of hope was built on a piece of copper designed to carry water, not war. Every man within earshot held his breath. Jenkins turned the key. For a moment, nothing. Then, a grinding, shuddering complaint from the overworked starter motor. Then, a low, wet cough. And finally, with a violent rattle that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their boots, the colossal Continental engine roared to life. It wasn't a smooth idle. The engine shook like a wet dog, the oil pressure light flickering erratically, and an unfamiliar, high-pitched whistle coming from deep within the engine bay. Ace stared at the tank, his face pale. It was running. It was alive. But it was held together by a prayer and a piece of home improvement. The war had always been fought with courage and sacrifice. But here, in the cold, it was being won with ingenuity and a desperate, almost comedic resourcefulness. The lieutenant climbed slowly into the commander's hatch. He looked down at Ace, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He didn't thank him. He just said, "Move out, Ace. We roll at 0400. The tank Jezebel, running on a ridiculous, faulty repair, began to churn its treads in the mud. The small, copper connection was holding, for now. But will this desperate fix hold when the world begins to shake? The noise was a physical thing. It wasn't the healthy roar of a finely tuned engine. It was a desperate, wet, vibrating scream that threatened to tear itself apart. It was the sound of 18 tons of steel moving forward on a prayer whispered through a copper tube. Inside the Jezebel, Sergeant Ace Asher couldn't hear the radio traffic or the grinding of the treads. All he could hear was the engine, the Continental a 975C1 radial, a 9-cylinder marvel that was now, thanks to him, a wounded animal. He sat strapped to his seat, a grease-stained oracle translating the engine song. Every tremor in the floor plate, every subtle change in pitch, was a signal. The high-pitched whistle, the sound of oil barely contained by the ridiculous copper pipe, was constant. It was the sound of his failure, or their salvation. They moved for nearly an hour through the dark, frozen woods. Each bump, each change in elevation, was a tiny, localized turning point. Ace felt his stomach clench whenever the tank tilted, sending a new surge of pressure into his reckless repair. He saw the looks on the faces of the gunner and the loader. They knew. They didn't know what Ace had done, but they knew Jezebel was running too loud, too hot, and too shaky to be truly whole. They were on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking down to zero. This was the historical reality of the war machine in 1944. The M4 Sherman, for all its flaws and triumphs, was the lifeblood of the Allied advance. It was designed for speed, mass production, and relative reliability. But it was never designed for the kind of logistical nightmare the armies were now facing. The line of supply, already stretched thin by the speed of the earlier breakthroughs, had snapped under the weight of the European winter. Spare parts, especially the small, specific, non-glamorous ones, vanished into the fog of bureaucracy and mud. A soldier could find a new rifle faster than a mechanic could find a simple, standardized oil gasket. The war had become a battle of entropy. The enemy was hoping American logistics would break first, The American soldiers were hoping their sheer will and improvisation would hold out. For Ace, this logistical collapse was more painful than any artillery fire. Before the war, he ran a small garage on the outskirts of Philadelphia. He was a craftsman. He prided himself on precision. He once spent 3 days hunting down a correct factory-issued carburetor for a 1937 Ford, refusing to use a cheaper, generic replacement. He believed in the machine's integrity. He remembered holding that Ford part, clean, perfect, and manufactured to specifications 1,000 miles away. He remembered the simple, easy confidence of his old life. Now, he was here, 1,000 miles from that garage, holding a piece of civilian plumbing and forcing it to perform a task for which it was utterly unqualified. He had sacrificed his professional honor for survival. This was the deep, unseen sacrifice of the mechanic in the field, the degradation of craft, the moral choice to use a terrible solution because a perfect one was simply unavailable. The war had forced him to be reckless. The air in the driver's compartment was thick with the smell of gasoline, burnt oil, and fear. The distant, heavy thudding they had heard hours ago was no longer distant. It was a rhythmic, growing bass note, enemy artillery beginning to range in on the sector. Jenkins' voice finally cut through the headphones, strained and sharp. "Ace, report. Pressure's high, Lieutenant. Running hot. The patch is holding, but I can feel the vibration working it loose. Every minute we run, the risk goes up." A sudden blast shook the Jezebel, sending a shower of earth and pebbles rattling against the hull. The tank lurched, and the engine's note spiked, a desperate, frantic sound. Ace gripped the sides of his seat, waiting for the hiss of failure. But the copper tube, against all physics and common sense, held. "Recon is reporting a breakthrough, Sergeant," Jenkins said, his voice flat with urgency. "Not a probe. A full, committed counterattack. They are moving armor into the valley right now." The destination of Jezebel had been a static position, a hole in the line they were supposed to plug. Now, they were driving straight into a full-scale assault. Ace knew what this meant. The frantic, improvised repair he had performed on the Jezebel was no longer a temporary fix to get them to the next motor pool. It was the only thing standing between the enemy and a catastrophic breach. He leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his knees, and grabbed the intercom mic. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice tight. "With all due respect, if we take this tank into a charge, this part will fail. It's not a matter of if. It's a matter of seconds. We need to fall back now and wait for support, or at least let me try to brace this thing." There was a long silence, punctuated by the terrible, grinding sound of the engine. Jenkins had to make the choice, but Ace had presented the truth. Jenkins, the man with an injured arm, who had confessed his reliance on this single steel box, finally spoke. "Sergeant Asher, we are the support. The enemy is moving faster than we thought. We have no choice but to engage now. Jezebel is operational, Ace, and that's all that matters to command." Ace flinched, not from fear of the enemy, but from the crushing weight of the commander's logic. Jenkins was right. The calculus of war did not allow for the caution of a mechanic. "Driver, full speed ahead." Jenkins yelled. The tank surged, accelerating rapidly down the firebreak and into the smoke. The copper pipe, the simple piece of plumbing from an American basement, was now under full combat stress. Ace closed his eyes, clenching his jaw against the mounting terror. The real battle had just begun, and it wasn't outside, but in the relentless, shuddering rhythm of the engine's heart. The shift from tense movement to immediate violence is rarely a smooth transition. It is a sudden, physical impact, a punch that rattles the teeth and demands instant clarity. For the men inside Jezebel, that transition was marked by two things: the deafening crack of their own 75mm main gun, and the agonizing shriek of the engine hitting maximum revolutions. Lieutenant Jenkins had positioned them brilliantly, or perhaps desperately. They had broken through the tree line just as the enemy's spearhead armor, 3 heavy tanks followed by infantry carriers, were moving into their staging area. Jezebel was a lonely, shuddering sentinel, but it was in the perfect place to ambush. The gunner fired, a concussive blast that momentarily stunned everyone inside. The sound was swallowed instantly by the relentless, frantic roar of the engine. Ace was pressed against the hull, his eyes wide. He wasn't watching the world outside through the narrow vision slit. He was watching the oil pressure gauge and listening to the high-frequency whistle of the copper pipe. The pressure needle was jittering wildly, dancing at the very edge of the red zone. The engine was screaming, a sound that was less power and more protest. Second target, load hay. Hurry up. Jenkins yelled over the noise. The reality of the situation was a psychological vice. The crew was performing heroically, responding to the chaos with practiced, lethal precision. They were a wall of steel and fire, focused entirely on the visible, outside threat. But the life of that wall, the mobility and power that allowed the gun to traverse and the treads to grip, depended entirely on the integrity of Ace's ridiculous, backyard fix. This was the true turning point of the battle. It wasn't the moment the gunner fired. It was the moment the engine had to hold its maximum output, under fire, for sustained minutes. The enemy tanks saw them and reacted. A shell struck the front glacis plate of Jezebel. The impact was catastrophic. It was a physical blow that threw the men sideways, extinguishing the light and filling the air with the metallic stink of burnt powder and ozone. The tank's radio instantly died. The engine stalled, then sputtered back to life, its screaming sound now punctuated by an irregular clack-clack-clack. In the sudden, terrifying silence of the stalled engine, Ace heard Jenkins' gasping breath. Status. Status. Ace didn't wait for the engine to fail again. He unbuckled his safety harness and slid into the cramped space adjacent to the engine bay, ignoring the shouted orders and the impact of small arms fire pinging off the hull. This was the moment of ultimate, silent bravery, a decision not to fight, but to listen. He pulled a small wrench from his belt. The copper pipe was vibrating so hard Ace could barely hold his hand against it. Oil, dark and hot, was beginning to weep from the forced seams. The vibrations were doing what the enemy shell could not, mechanically dismantling the repair from the inside out. The clack-clack-clack was getting louder. Something was breaking apart. Ace knew he couldn't tighten the clamps anymore. The copper would tear. He had only one option, a terrifying gamble that flew in the face of every rule of engine maintenance. He used the wrench to gently, painstakingly, loosen the clamp by a fraction of a turn. It was the only way to relieve the enormous, localized pressure that was causing the metal fatigue. "Are you out of your mind, Ace?" Jenkins' voice screamed through the internal intercom. "We are under fire. Get back to your position." "The pipe is tearing, Lieutenant. I have to relieve the stress." Ace yelled back, his voice hoarse. The moment he eased the tension, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack softened, replaced by a louder, more consistent whistle of leaking oil. The pressure gauge needle dropped instantly, dangerously low. The engine, however, settled into a rougher, but more sustainable, idle. He had traded immediate pressure for a slow, controlled bleed. Ace was completely exposed to the engine, inches from a mechanical breakdown that would render the tank useless. His eyes were not on the enemy outside, but on the tiny bead of oil forming on the copper pipe. He was listening to the sound of his own death being postponed by seconds. Outside, the chaos raged. The gunner and the loader worked as a perfect machine. They managed to take out the second heavy tank, the impact momentarily silencing the external fire aimed at Jezebel. But now the enemy infantry was closing in, knowing the crippled American tank was alone. Jenkins, seeing the gunner needed space, grabbed the driver's shoulder. "Give me 15 yards forward, slow. Just enough to clear the field of fire." The driver obeyed. The tank surged, a short, brutal burst of power. Ace held his breath, leaning over the protesting copper. The pipe held. The pressure surged, held, and settled back down. It was a piece of metal, a common, pedestrian piece of copper, fighting for its life. The Jezebel took out the third enemy tank. The localized attack, the planned spearhead, was broken. The enemy infantry, losing their armor support, hesitated and began to fall back under their own artillery barrage. The battle climaxed not with a grand explosion, but with a horrifying, drawn-out grind of metal, smoke, and fear. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure receded. The heavy, grinding noise outside faded into the background. The firing stopped. The battle was over. Ace finally pulled himself out of the engine bay, his face blackened and slick with oil, his hands shaking. He looked at Lieutenant Jenkins, who was slumped in his seat, the adrenaline fading to leave him utterly exhausted. "What's the status, Ace?" Jenkins whispered, not even trying to yell now. Ace reached up and touched the flickering oil gauge. The needle was below the acceptable limit. The whistle was constant. "We held, Lieutenant," Ace said, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "The line didn't break. But the pipe won't hold another run. Not like that." The Jezebel was motionless, the lone survivor. It hadn't been the most powerful machine, or the best maintained. It was merely the one that, for 15 terrifying minutes, had refused to die. And its survival had been bought with a piece of plumbing. The silence that returned was deeper than the silence before the battle, heavy with the weight of spent violence and unspoken sacrifice. Ace sat down, his hands trembling. He looked at the copper pipe, now exposed and scarred, a tiny, defiant detail amidst the colossal destruction. He had won a battle, not with a bullet, but with a wrench and a calculated risk. They were alive, but the life of the machine was now on a thread. A reckoning was coming, not from the enemy, but from their own command. The smoke clears slowly in the frozen air, revealing the consequences of their 15 minutes of survival. The landscape is ruined, blackened earth, shattered trees, and the silent, hulking forms of enemy armor, twisted and burning. And amidst the wreckage, a single, battered M4 Sherman tank, Jezebel, stood alone. It was a stark, brutal image of victory. The counterattack had been broken. The line held. But the victory felt small and exhausted, like a man who has barely managed to pull himself from the wreckage of a house fire. Ace was outside, working feverishly. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a triage surgeon. The engine needed attention immediately, and the copper pipe was weeping oil steadily onto the engine block. The heat from the tank had melted the immediate surrounding snow, creating a dark, greasy puddle beneath them. The rest of the company finally arrived, cautiously making their way through the ruined sector. They looked at the Jezebel with a mixture of awe and disbelief. One sergeant, the commander of the newly arrived relief armor, climbed out of his own tank, his helmet tucked under his arm. He was Captain Miller, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol. Miller walked straight up to Lieutenant Jenkins, who was still slumped weakly in the commander's hatch. "Jenkins," Miller's voice was clipped. "Report. What in God's name happened here? We heard the fire, then silence. You're the only steel left on this grid." Jenkins pointed a shaky hand toward the ruined tanks. "We engaged the advance armor, sir. Full frontal assault. They broke. Jezebel took the brunt, but held." Miller nodded, his face grim. He began to inspect the exterior damage, noting the shrapnel scars and the scoring on the glacis plate. Everything looked exactly as it should, a tank that had fought and won. Then Miller's gaze fell upon Ace, who was frantically using a rag to wipe away the steadily dripping oil from the engine bay. The captain stepped closer, peering into the open compartment. The smell was wrong, too hot, too oily. He saw the pipe. It was impossible to miss. Amidst the factory-stamped steel, the military-issue hoses, and the heavy engine block, was the shining, almost comical glint of copper plumbing. It was a visual insult to the professionalism of the Army Ordnance Corps. "Sergeant Asher." Miller's voice was suddenly loud, cutting through the fatigue of the battlefield. "What is that component? Identify that part immediately." Ace stopped wiping, his heart hammering against his ribs. The moment of reckoning had arrived, not from the Germans, but from the army itself. He stood up slowly, facing the furious captain. "Sir, it's a temporary bypass, sir," Ace stammered, using the official term for his outrageous act. "Temporary bypass for what? That is not standard issue, Sergeant. That looks like something pulled from a civilian radiator. Did you scavenge this from a barn?" Miller demanded, his face tight with anger. The very thought of non-regulation parts being used in combat armor was anathema to him. If the word got out, it would be a logistical scandal. Ace didn't try to lie. He was too tired for prevarication. "No, sir. It's a 1/4-inch section of home water pipe. Copper. I found it in a scrap pile in Antwerp 3 weeks ago. The specialized oil pump gasket failed last night. The replacement is not available. I had to choose between using that or turning this vehicle into a stationary pillbox. I chose the pipe, sir." The air went dead silent. Miller stared at the mechanic, then at the pipe, and then at the 3 smoking hulks on the field 50 yards away, the clear evidence of Jezebel's solitary stand. The sheer audacity of the confession hung heavy between them. A normal captain would have had Ace immediately placed under report, possibly confined for endangering a combat unit through unauthorized improvisation. The regulations were ironclad. Unauthorized parts could compromise the whole machine. But Captain Miller had eyes. He looked at the carnage, at the exhaustion on Jenkins's face, and at the still, shaking engine that was breathing its last. He realized that this tank, which should have been dead in the mud hours ago, had won a major tactical victory. The pipe had held. Miller walked over to the back of the tank, pulling a notebook and pencil from his pocket. He did not look at Ace or Jenkins. He wrote a brief note on the tank's maintenance log, his hand surprisingly steady. When he finished, he ripped the page out and returned to Ace. Instead of tearing into the mechanic, he pressed the small, handwritten note into his oily hand. "Sergeant Asher," Miller said, his voice now low and measured, "I cannot approve this repair. It violates every known protocol. But I also cannot deny the results." He pointed to the note. "Keep this taped inside the engine compartment. It is your official documentation for the next motor pull you hit." The note, written in the clear, firm hand of a man who dealt in facts, read, "Repair performed with non-standard civilian part, copper pipe. Held under fire. Do not replace. The tactical consequence of failure was unacceptable. Repair maintained integrity during full combat stress." Ace looked at the note, dumbfounded. It wasn't a citation for bravery. It was a memo on utility. The Army had just formally recognized a piece of plumbing as a valid combat part. The repair was now a talisman, a living piece of forgotten history taped inside the steel hull. Ace didn't feel celebration or pride. He felt a wave of crushing relief. The trauma of the battle had been replaced by the sheer exhaustion of having survived the bureaucratic and mechanical threat. He had gambled his life and his career on a civilian copper pipe, and for this moment, he had won. Jezebel was now truly running on borrowed time. It was impossible to keep it running much longer. But for Ace, the true legacy wasn't the victory itself, but the note, the official acknowledgement that when supplies fail and protocol becomes a suicide pact, the smallest, most resourceful act of a human being can save the line. Years later, the story of the copper pipe would surface, not in a military history journal, but in a small, forgotten article in a local Philadelphia newspaper, a footnote in the grand history of the war. It was a story of a mechanic who brought a piece of home to the battlefield and forced it to fight. The war ended, as all wars must, not with a sudden clap of thunder, but with the slow, grinding withdrawal of noise. The tank Jezebel, having survived the battle of the copper pipe, survived the war. It was retired, its steel scarred and its engine forever whispering with the memory of that one desperate moment. In 1947, a photograph was taken of Jezebel in a sprawling, anonymous American scrapyard. The tank looked enormous, inert, and exhausted. If you could have peered inside the gutted engine bay, you might have still seen the official memo, Captain Miller's note, still taped near the oil pump housing, "Do not replace." But the real story of the copper pipe did not end on the battlefield or in a scrapyard. It ended in the quiet, unassuming life of Sergeant Roy Ace Asher. He came home to Philadelphia, not as a decorated hero, but as a deeply tired mechanic. He reopened his auto shop, and the smell of clean grease and fresh oil replaced the permanent stink of cordite and fear. He spent the next 3 decades doing his job the right way, meticulously, replacing every worn gasket with the perfect, factory-standard part. He built a new life defined by carefulness, a deliberate rejection of the recklessness the war had forced upon him. He seldom talked about the war. When he did, it wasn't about the shellfire or the terror of the enemy. It was about the cold, the mud, and the impossible parts. The true climax of this story was not a battle, but a moment of domestic peace, years later. It was a chilly Saturday morning in the early 1960s. Ace was in his basement, installing a new copper water heater, a job far removed from the high-pressure world of the Continental radial engine. He was cutting and soldering new copper pipe, the scent of flux and the heat of the torch filling the small, brightly lit room. He reached for a 1/4-inch section of pipe, the exact same dimension as the piece he jammed into the Jezebel so long ago. As his fingers closed around the cool, smooth metal, the memory hit him, not as a sharp trauma, but as a physical sensation, the frantic vibration, the whistle of leaking oil, the claustrophobic dread of that engine compartment. It wasn't a heroic flashback. It was the memory of overwhelming pressure. The pressure to perform a miracle with trash. The pressure that had been contained by this simple, beautiful, common piece of copper. Ace stopped working. He stared at the pipe in his hand. His grandson, a curious boy of 10 named Roy Jr., came downstairs to watch him work. "Grandpa, why are you sitting?" the boy asked. Ace looked at the boy, then at the pipe. This was the only thing he could talk about, the only story that felt real, because it was about a mundane object that had defied its nature. "I was just thinking about a stupid repair I made a long time ago, kid," Ace said, his voice husky. Was it a bad repair? The worst. It should have failed. It was just a piece of pipe like this one. Designed to carry water, right? Just water. Ace tapped the copper gently. But it was all we had. And if it broke, the whole tank, the whole line, it was all going to burn. The boy didn't understand the military tactics or the M4 Sherman specifications, but he understood the simple, terrifying utility of the object in his grandfather's hand. Did it break? The boy asked. Ace smiled, a slow, weary smile that contained the weight of that frozen December day. No, Ace whispered. It didn't break. The victory, kid, wasn't the tank firing its gun. The victory was that this little piece of pipe, this cheap, common piece of copper, decided to hold on when everything else was screaming to fail. It decided to be stronger than it was supposed to be, for just 15 minutes. This was the ultimate emotional resolution. The war wasn't won by the technology of destruction, but by the smallest, most desperate acts of human ingenuity and resourcefulness, the pieces of home they brought to the battlefield and forced into combat. Sergeant Roy Ace Asher didn't win a battle with bullets. He won it by realizing that utility, when coupled with necessity, transcends specification. He won it by understanding that sometimes, the most common objects are capable of the most uncommon acts of resilience. He had forced a machine to behave like a human being, flawed, imperfectly patched, yet absolutely refusing to quit. Ace looked at his old, calloused hands, the same hands that had turned the wrench on that day. He reached out and carefully soldered the copper pipe into the water heater, sealing it forever into the reliable, peaceful mechanism of his home. We forget the great speeches. We forget the grand strategies. But sometimes, we find a story that reminds us of the true, undertold history of the war. The sacrifice was often not a grand charge, but the quiet, terrified choice to rely on the impossible. The mechanic looked at the newly installed copper pipe, clean and shining in his basement. We forget the great speeches, but we never forget the small things we built that somehow refused to break.